In today's video, I want to talk about how to read academic papers and more importantly, how to take notes for them. Hi, if you're new to the channel, my name is Jonathan. I'm a third-year PhD student from the University of Waterloo. I study financial accounting, and reading papers, synthesizing research, and taking notes is pretty much what I do every single day. As an academic, reading papers is the primary way to learn about a certain topic, and in order to become an expert in a particular area and develop your own research, you need to get a good understanding of the literature. Now, a particular topic within the area you're interested in can have tons of papers that were published by researchers in the past, and your job is to read through all those papers, synthesize the data, and eventually identify a potential gap within the literature where you can insert your interesting research question. Now, when I started my PhD program, nobody really taught me how to read academic papers or how to take notes for them because it's very different taking notes for these types of papers compared to taking notes from a textbook or from a lecture. That's why in today's video, I think that it'll be really helpful for me to show you how I read my papers and how I take notes. Now, just a disclaimer, everybody learns differently and what works for me may not actually work for you. And honestly, I've only started using this method this year because for the past 2 years of my PhD program, I've been experimenting with various different types of studying methods, and finally I'm able to find one that kind of suits my learning style. So right now in front of you, we see my template that I use to take all of the notes every time I read an academic paper. And as you can see, it's in a table format, it's in Notion, but you can definitely use Microsoft Excel to create the exact same table. And I think that this template is the best way for me to essentially summarize a 20 to 40 page academic paper down to a table that only contains the core information that's relevant for me to get the key takeaways out of each study. I strongly think that handwriting your notes when it comes to academic papers is the most wasteful use of time that you can do, simply because handwriting your notes has been proven to not actually help you with memorization or understanding the concepts. The whole point of note-taking, in my opinion, is really just to identify and record the key takeaways out of each study. And copy and pasting straight out of the paper into this template is honestly the most efficient way to get that done. And then after you extract all the relevant information and put it into this template, then you can spend additional time actually trying to memorize and understand the material. So note-taking is one piece of the puzzle, but note-taking is separate from actually memorizing and understanding the material, in my opinion. And so right now, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna show you guys how this template works and why the template that I'm using today might be a little bit different from the template that's going to work for you. So as you can see here, I have a couple studies about managerability. So I have one separate template for each subject area within financial accounting. So this template is specifically for managerability, but I have other templates for other subjects. For example, I have a template for CFO compensation, bank efficiency, and so forth. Now, every time I read a paper, that is creating one additional entry in my template, which is represented by that row. So for example, I have back in all 2011. So that's the author and the year that the paper was published. I obviously have the title of the paper, so CEO ability and management earnings forecast. I want to keep track of the journal that the paper is published in. I also want to keep track of the topic area that the paper is talking about. So this one is talking about managerability and management forecast, but you can also see that, for example, the paper below, even though it's also within managerability, but it's talking about another topic called income smoothing. Sometimes papers will have keywords in order to help you search that paper in a certain database. For this particular paper, it didn't provide any keywords, but for other ones that they do provide something. So here we jump into some of the columns that I have. So first one I have is key takeaways. So am I able to summarize the paper in 1 or 2 sentences? And what is the key piece of learning that I got from reading this paper? And I think it's really important to have a key takeaway because it really tests you on your understanding of the paper and if you are able to pretty much summarize 20 to 40 pages of the study into a couple sentences. So first I have key takeaways. Next I have the key findings. So these are the key findings of the paper. So these are obviously going to be a little bit more detailed than the key takeaway itself. And I'll show you guys where I typically collect the key findings out of the actual paper. Next I have something called purpose. So purpose is all about what is the purpose of the studying being done? You know, is it trying to show us a new methodology of doing something? Is it trying to establish a new relationship? like what is the whole point of this paper? And that's really important because if you can understand what's the point of the paper, then typically that can kind of speak to the contribution of the paper itself. Some papers will also talk about the motivation behind their study. So the authors will try to rationalize why they think that their study is important, why they think that it's going to contribute to the literature. So understanding the motivation, in my opinion, is also pretty important. Next, we have something called hypothesis development and theory. And then right next to it, we have something called hypothesis. So if you are doing research, then the hypothesis represents pretty much the prediction that the author is trying to make in the study. And so I will typically just copy and paste the hypothesis directly from the paper into the cell. And then the authors also will try to explain why they're making that particular prediction. You know, like what's their underlying mechanism or underlying reason they think that this prediction is going to behave in a particular way. So that prediction could be because of an existing theory that was established in the literature. In this case, there's something called the Truman 1986 theory that the authors in this paper referenced. It might also be because of results of previous studies that were done within the area that might help the authors motivate their hypothesis. So not only understanding the prediction of the paper, but also understanding the reason why that prediction is made is also really important. The next set of columns kind of deals with data collection as well as the research design. So because my field of research is financial accounting using empirical/archival methods, this is going to be really specific to my area of research. But for example, if you do another type of research, maybe using behavioral or field experiment, then maybe these column names won't be as appropriate for you. So feel free to definitely change the column that fits the type of research that you're conducting. But because I'm all about empirical and archival methods, it's important to me to keep track of, you know, what kind of databases they're using, how they create their sample out of the population, and what kind of regressions or econometric techniques they're using. So I always keep track of the sample. So specifically, I like to keep track of the years that the sample is covering, so the period that the study is covering. I keep track of the different types of data sources. So, you know, where are they getting this data from? Is that a database that my university is subscribed to? As I talked about, I do a lot of archival research, so that's why my methods is mostly archival, but sometimes I might read a paper that's using that's using experimental methods, or maybe qualitative research that's still within managerability, but simply using another type of technique to perform their study. And then because I am all about using archival data, so the next set of columns is going to be about the regression or the empirical techniques that the study uses. So I have a column for research design. So, you know, are they using an OLS? Are they using maybe propensity score matching? Maybe they're using a diff and diff. That kind of gets all tracked in this research design problem. And then I also kind of like to mention just what dependent variable is being regressed on what independent variable. So for example, in this one, the paper does, you know, three different types of regressions within their paper. So I just make a note of what those three different research designs are. And the next piece, I like to kind of keep track of the dependent variables and the independent variables and the control variables. So when you're doing research, you might have heard something called the Libby boxes, where it's pretty much this diagram that lets you keep track of what is the key independent and dependent variable that you're interested in on a conceptual level, as well as on an operational level. So conceptual level typically refers to, you know, what are the concepts that you're interested in studying? And operational level will just refer to how exactly is the author measuring that conceptual construct. And that's really important for you to keep track of as a researcher, because it's very possible that you may want to measure a similar construct or the same construct, and you may want to measure it the same way that the author did in their paper. Or if you feel that the author's way of measuring something is not ideal, then maybe this is your opportunity to actually tweak it and make a better way of measuring that same construct. So for example, here, one of the constructs that the paper looks at is the likelihood of issuing a management earnings forecast. And the way that they operationalize it or measure it in the regression is to have this variable, a dummy variable that equals 1 if an annual management earnings forecast in year T and 0 otherwise. So just keeping track of the constructs and how they operationalize it in the paper is really important. And I do that for both the dependent variable. I also do that for the key independent variable of interest. And then I also like to keep track of the different types of control variables that the author controls for in the regression. Again, because if I'm interested in this area and I'm looking to do a study in this area, I may have to use some of these same control variables in my study. And when it comes to identifying what's the appropriate control variables, looking at other studies within the area and relying on prior literature is a great starting point. I also like to keep track of robustness tests, and robustness tests are pretty much additional tests that the authors do to essentially try to convince you that what they find in their main test still exists. So they might, expand the sample, they might perform other empirical tests, they might try to rule out alternative explanations, they might measure things differently to see if they get the same results. Keeping track of robustness tests, in my opinion, is pretty important because you may have to do those similar robustness tests in your study. And then here I have some other columns that sometimes I'll fill out, but sometimes I won't, depending on the paper itself and whether I find that information informative. So for example, here I have a column for cross-sectional tests. So typically in the empirical and archival world, a lot of studies will have cross-sectional studies to essentially split up this main sample into smaller subsamples to see whether or not the results that they find in their main results is driven by a certain subsample versus another subsample. So sometimes if the paper doesn't have cross-sectional tests, I'll leave this column blank. I have a column for background, so if there's any sort of background information in the literature review part of the paper that maybe I didn't know beforehand, but I find really interesting, or I feel that the information is really important, then I'll kind of keep it in this column. And then I have something called important quotes, where sometimes you read a paper and sometimes papers will kind of quote whether it's important people in the government or practitioners, or maybe it's a quote that I read in someone else's paper and I really want to use that quote in my paper, then I'll just kind of keep a note of that quote within this template. So these are the types of things that I kind of track currently. Sometimes I will make adjustments to this table. For example, I might have a future research question column where if I think of a research question that's related to the paper, I might want to just keep a note of that. But overall, this is the template that I use to essentially take notes on a paper. And all these information that you see within the template, this is all simply just copy and pasted directly from the paper into this template. Right now, obviously, when you're actually writing your paper, please do not plagiarize the studies that you're referencing, right? You're obviously going to have to write things in your own words, but for the sake of just synthesizing the information and just getting it on paper, I think copy and pasting is totally fine. And here, these are usually the key pieces of information that I'm trying to extract out of the paper. Now, you may feel that there are certain columns here that don't apply to your area of research, or you might feel that I don't have enough columns and you want to add more columns to the template. Definitely take this template with a grain of salt and customize it to the type of research that you typically do. You also notice that the way that this template is formatted, it's really geared towards academic papers. For example, I do read a lot of business press articles, for example, from the Wall Street Journal or from the New York Times, talking about accounting, and the way that business press articles are written, that doesn't really fit the template that I have right here. So for those types of articles, whenever I read those, I would typically just use a Microsoft Word document and kind of take notes the old-fashioned way, if you will. But when it comes to academic papers, then this is definitely the template that I think is going to be really helpful. And what's great about this is that not only can you use this for any type of literature review that you do for a working paper, or if you're taking a PhD seminar or master's seminar where you are reading papers and you have to kind of engage in discussion with a professor, this is a great tool to have, especially in class, because let's say you want to talk about a particular paper, then you have all the key points right here in front of you on your laptop screen. And so it's very easy for you to kind of recall that information and be more active and more confident when you talk about the paper. In addition, if you are planning to write your comprehensive exam and your comprehensive exam is open book and tests a lot of the papers that you talked about in your previous seminars, then this, again, is a great way to synthesize all the papers that you've read in class, especially when you're dealing with like 50 to 100 papers, have everything organized in this really clean template. And I think that this is a great tool for any sort of master's or PhD student to have. Or honestly, even if you've already completed your PhD degree and you're working as a professor, I think this template can definitely be really helpful to you. Okay, so the next part of the video, I do want to show an example of an academic paper, specifically within financial accounting. And I just want to show you guys how I annotate the paper and how I take the information from the paper and put it into that template. So here I have an example of a typical financial accounting paper. Within the accounting literature, you'll notice that a lot of papers are written in a particular way, and you might notice that about the papers that you read in the journals that you're interested in. So when it comes to accounting papers, we typically have, an abstract, an introduction. There's typically then a background or literature review section, then maybe a theory development or hypothesis development. Then it goes into sample selection, data sources, research design, results, cross-sectional tests, robustness tests, and then a conclusion. So those are kind of the main headings that exist within the accounting literature, and I strongly recommend that as you are digging into your area of interest, try to keep a mental note of what are the headings or subheadings within the papers, because those can actually be potential columns in that note template that I showed you guys. So here we have the abstract. So the abstract is a high level summary of the paper. It's usually just about a paragraph, and typically within the abstract, you can kind of pick out key pieces of information that you can actually throw into your template. So for example, right now I made a note of the theory that they used within the paper, so capital crunch theory. I also highlighted the results from the paper. The abstract can also kind of give some hints about what the key dependent variable and independent variable of the study is. And that's, again, stuff you can always put into your template. And you can see here what I'm doing when I'm taking notes is that I'm just highlighting the key pieces of information that I'm planning to copy and paste into my template. And I'm just making some sort of little notes on the side indicating, okay, where do I want to slot this piece of information into my template? So this is obviously saying that I want to copy and paste this into my theory column, whereas this is going to be copy and pasted into my results column. So here comes the introduction. So within the introduction, again, it gives a high-level view of the paper, a lot more in depth compared to the abstract, but still pretty high level. And the introduction has a lot of information that you can definitely copy and paste into your paper. But you can see here that I'm just kind of highlighting things that I find interesting. So right now what I'm highlighting are essentially pieces of information that I didn't know about in the past. And based on what I'm seeing right now, this information will probably kind of fall into the background section of my template, because it's kind of talking about some institutional knowledge about banking and lending and things like that. You can also see how I have some little comments here onto the side just about the paper. But again, I'm not handwriting a lot of stuff, right? I'm just highlighting key pieces of information that I may want to copy and paste into my template. We can see a little bit more of that here. So we can see here on the side, I have very nice quote. Specifically, I'm referring to the quote by the comptroller of the currency, John C. Dugan, right? I also highlighted, for example, this is the purpose of the paper. I'm going to copy and paste that into the purpose column of my template. I made a note about an important regulation in banking, right, that I want to keep note of. So again, just highlighting it for now. And then when I'm reading the paper, I'm also keeping note of these studies that this paper has cited, and whether or not I think that those cited papers are things that I need to read in the future. So for example, I circled this Financial Stability Forum report in red, because I'm trying to tell myself that, hey, I think that this cited source from the paper is really important, and I think that the knowledge in this report is something that I need to know as well. So this is just a note to myself to read this after I finish the current paper. But again, just highlighting key pieces of information. For example, here, I'm highlighting information about the hypothesis, right? I'm making notes about how things are being measured. So this is the operationalization of some of the constructs. I'm making note of the databases that are being used. I'm making note of just some key pieces of information in the research design, right? But again, I'm not spending a lot of time handwriting these notes. Here I just make note of that, they did a cross-sectional test, and here I see this is an example of the main findings, so I just keep a note of that as well. But overall, it's very, very light in terms of handwritten notes, and really just picking apart the paper and identifying which pieces of information I want to copy and paste into my template. Again, here's another example, right? I'm using my red pen to indicate that maybe I want to pay attention to these to accounting standards, and maybe I want to read them after I finish reading the paper. Right here, we jump into the hypothesis development section of the paper, and all I'm really doing is just highlighting in red, where the hypotheses are in the paper, what are some important theories. Again, here, I'm circling a side of paper that I think might be important for me to read into the future. Now, this part of the research design, specifically for me, because I am into empirical and archival research, sometimes I'll actually take a screenshot of the actual regression that they have in the paper. So what I would typically do is use my snipping tool and just pretty much take a screenshot of this entire regression, copy and paste it right into Notion, just so when I do want to reference back to the paper and I want to see how they designed their test, then I can just refer to the screenshot within my Notion rather than having to dig through all these pages of the paper. It's just more efficient. And obviously the research design part of the paper is going to be really important, specifically what type of variables that they use, how they operationalize it. So just having a screenshot of the regression, in my opinion, is a great thing to have in your notes. Again, here, we're just having another example where, again, I'm just circling papers that I think might be important for me. Again, I would have screenshotted this regression figure as well and just put that in my notes. So when it comes to actually reading the paper, I will switch between using the laptop or using a tablet. So it's kind of a day-to-day thing. Some days I feel that reading on a laptop, I'm really effective and I can focus really easily, but sometimes I do want to kind of engage in the physical movement of using a pen and kind of writing it on something. So whenever I feel like that, I'll use my Microsoft Surface Pro 7, and then I'll just essentially open the PDF on my tablet and then use the Microsoft Pen and make my annotations there. So overall, that's pretty much how I read my accounting papers and how I take my notes. If you find that this template is helpful, then I definitely suggest that you incorporate some version of that template into your day-to-day workflow, especially if you're reading a lot of papers as a master's or PhD student. Personally, this way of studying has been really effective for me for the past year, and I definitely see myself sticking with this method for the rest of my PhD program. If you guys found the video helpful, then please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel. I do appreciate it a lot. And if you guys are interested in following my PhD journey, well, I got a lot more for you guys. I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.